The smell of engine exhaust and wet concrete was the last thing Auden registered before her stepmother's hand landed flat between her shoulder blades and shoved. She didn't scream. She'd run out of that particular response sometime around the 6-month anniversary of her father's death, when Gail had poured cold coffee over her head for forgetting to buy creamer. Screaming only ever made Gail angrier, and Auden had learned early to conserve energy for the things that actually mattered. She caught herself on her palms, the rough asphalt scraping skin, rain already soaking through the knees of her jeans. "Stand up," Gail hissed. "You look like a dog." Auden stood up. The parking garage behind the Meridian Hotel was quiet at this hour, lit by the stuttering yellow of 2 functioning sodium lamps out of 6. Auden's stepsister Poppy stood 3 feet back, shoulders hunched against the rain, phone buried in both hands. She wasn't watching. She'd made a choice a long time ago to simply not watch things that might later require her to feel something. The black SUV that pulled in didn't rush. It moved like something that had never learned urgency, because it had never needed to. It stopped. A man in a charcoal suit got out, opened an umbrella, walked around the hood, and opened the rear passenger door. The man who stepped out wasn't what Auden had braced for. She'd been told monster. She'd been told the kind of name people say quietly in back rooms and not at all in police stations. She'd spent the 40-minute drive from Gail's rental house mentally cataloguing everything she could use as a weapon in a parking garage. A car key, a fire extinguisher mounted to the cement pillar, her own teeth if it came to that. Roman Vasic was just a man, tall, broad in the shoulders, dark coat. His hair was damp and his face was a study in exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from one bad night but from several years of them. He looked at Auden with eyes the color of grey slate, flat, thorough, clinical, and didn't look at Gail at all. "Mr. Vasic," Gail said, her voice sliding into the register she used on landlords and collection agencies. Warm, reasonable, deeply false. "I brought her, exactly as we agreed." Vasic looked at Auden the way a man looks at a column of numbers he isn't sure adds up. He took in the wet canvas sneakers, the oversized jacket that had been her father's, the scraped palms she held slightly away from her body. His expression didn't change. "This is the collateral, not a question, a ledger entry spoken aloud." "She's capable," Gail said quickly. "Hard worker, quiet, she won't be any trouble." The suited man beside Vasic produced a thick envelope from his jacket and dropped it on the concrete between them. It landed in a puddle. Gail flinched, then crouched for it anyway. "Your markers," the suited man said. "Mr. Vasic doesn't extend credit twice." Gail was already tearing at the envelope flap. Poppy grabbed her mother's arm and pulled her toward the parking garage exit without a word in Auden's direction. No goodbye, not even a glance over a shoulder, just the wet slap of Poppy's boot soles on concrete and then nothing. Vasic nodded toward the open door of the SUV. "Get in." Auden looked at her scraped hands. She could run. She knew the street grid of this neighborhood from 3 years of working a late shift at the diner 4 blocks over. She could disappear into the alley system, find a bus, get 2 states away before Gail thought to call anyone. She had $14 in her jacket pocket. She got in. The interior smelled of leather, dark tobacco, and something expensive she couldn't name. The heat came on immediately, wrapping around her like something she hadn't earned. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed herself against the far door. Vasic got in beside her, the door closed. The rain became a sound effect instead of a physical fact. "You're bleeding on the upholstery," he said, not looking up from the phone in his hand. "Sorry," her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Send the bill to Gail. She's flush tonight." A pause. Not a laugh, but adjacent to one. "There's a first aid kit under the seat in front of you." She found it. Small, sealed, military surplus. She cleaned the scrapes with an antiseptic wipe and pressed gauze to the worst one while the city slid past the tinted windows. "Where are you taking me?" she said, not asking, inventorying. "My property. You'll have a room, meals. You won't be touched." For how long? Until the debt is resolved or the terms change, whichever comes first. He still didn't look up. Stop waiting for the other shoe. There isn't one tonight. She stared at the back of the driver's headrest and thought about $14, and the fact that she hadn't eaten since 6 that morning because Gail had needed the grocery money for something else. She thought about the floor of Gail's spare bedroom where she'd been sleeping on a folded blanket for 11 months because the woman had rented the actual bed to a cousin. She pressed the gauze harder against her palm and felt, underneath the fear, a strange and deeply inconvenient thread of relief. The Vasic compound wasn't a dungeon. It was a house built into the ridge above the harbor, all concrete and glass and clean geometric lines, the kind of architecture that communicated power by refusing to be decorative about it. Vasic walked through the front door, dropped his keys on a side table, and pointed down a hallway. Second door on the right. You'll find clothes in the closet. Don't go into the east corridor. Breakfast is at 7. Auden stood in the entry and looked at him. That's it. Vasic paused with his coat half off his shoulders. Were you expecting something else? I was expecting to be locked in. She held his gaze, or worse. He finished removing his coat, hung it, and turned to face her with the same measuring expression he'd worn in the parking garage. The silence in the house was enormous, broken only by rain against the glass and the distant, rhythmic sound of harbor water. Gail owed me $40,000, he said. She spent it on table games she didn't understand and convinced herself she'd run out of options. She hadn't. She had other options. She chose this one because she decided you were expendable. He paused. I agreed to the exchange because she needs to believe she sacrificed something that cost her. That guilt is more useful to me than the money. So you took me to punish her. I took you because it was the cheaper solution. He turned away. Go to sleep, Auden. No one is going to hurt you tonight. She found the room, clean, quiet, a bed with actual sheets. She locked the door, knowing perfectly well that the lock meant nothing in a house like this, stripped off her wet clothes and stood in the shower until the water ran cold, scrubbing Gail's rental house off her skin layer by layer. When she crawled into the bed, she waited for the panic to arrive. What arrived instead was a bone-deep exhaustion and the slow, nauseating awareness that the most secure she'd felt in 2 years was in a room belonging to a man the city's organized crime division had 11 open investigations on. She closed her eyes. She slept. The first 2 weeks were a strange, suspended thing. Auden moved through the compound like she was testing ice thickness, one careful step at a time. There were guards at the perimeter. She clocked 4 during the first 3 days, cataloguing their rotation the way she used to catalogue Gail's moods. Predictable things were survivable things. One of them, a younger man with close-cropped hair and a long scar along his jaw, left meal trays outside her door when she didn't come down. She never heard him knock, just found the tray when she opened her door and left the empty one back in the hall. After the 3rd day, she started coming down to the kitchen instead. Vasic was there every morning. Black coffee. A tablet with financials on it. He didn't speak to her the first morning, and she didn't speak to him, and they existed in the same space at a careful distance like 2 animals that have decided not to use their teeth today. On the 9th morning, without looking up, he said, "You're losing weight." Auden kept her eyes on the mug she was filling. I eat. You eat like someone who expects the plate to be taken away mid-meal. She turned around. He was watching her now, the tablet set aside, his slate eyes direct and entirely too perceptive. He looked tired again. He always looked tired in the mornings, like the night demanded more from him than the day did. I've been eating like this for 2 years, she said. It's not a performance. I know. He picked up the tablet again. There's more in the refrigerator than you're taking. That's not an observation. It's permission. She hated how much that one word did to her. She started eating real meals after that. The situation changed on a Thursday. Auden was in the library. She'd found it on day 4 and spent most of her hours there, reading whatever was on the shelves, when the front door opened wrong, not the measured weight of someone who owned the space. Too hard, too fast. She moved into the hallway. Vasic was against the far wall, the man at his side pressing a folded cloth to his ribs. The cloth was dark. The smell hit her before she was close enough to see clearly, copper and something sharper underneath it. "Go back to your room," Vasic said. His voice was controlled but thin at the edges. "You're bleeding through the cloth." Auden looked at the guard. "There's a trauma kit somewhere in this house." "Where?" The guard looked at Vasic. Vasic's jaw tightened. "Black bag." She got the bag. She put on gloves. She cut away the ruined shirt and assessed the wound, while Vasic sat rigid on the bench near the door and stared straight ahead like stubbornness was a medical treatment. "Hold still," she said. "I've been stabbed before." "Congratulations, hold still." She flushed the wound and began working, watching his breathing rather than his face, the controlled exhale, the deliberate stillness, the way his hands stayed flat on his thighs instead of gripping anything. He wasn't used to being helped. He'd done this alone before, and the absence of panic in him wasn't bravery so much as practiced resignation. "Why didn't you call anyone?" she said, threading the needle. "There's a leak. Anyone I call tonight potentially has a connection to whoever paid for this. I'm narrowing the list." She started stitching. His hand came down over her wrist once, not grabbing, just pressing, the way people redirect pain when they won't let it out, and then released when she looked at it. "Your father," he said after a moment. "He was sick." She kept her eyes on the work. "Kidney disease, 4 years of it. We couldn't always get to the clinic." "You learned to manage." "People act like that's impressive. It was just math. What can we do? What does it cost? What's the order of operations?" She tied off the stitch. "Why didn't you run?" "In the parking garage." Auden set down the forceps. "I had $14. "Before that, before tonight, why didn't you take something from Gail and leave?" She looked at him squarely. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the ledger assessment, not the flat exhaustion. Something more focused, more careful. "Because I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. "And every time I thought about it, I thought about what she'd tell people afterward, that I'd abandoned them, that I'd stolen something on my way out. I didn't want to spend my whole life looking over my shoulder at her version of events." She stripped off the gloves. "Getting in your car wasn't surrender. It was choosing a different set of walls." "These are better walls," he said. "The heating works," she agreed, and picked up the trauma kit and walked back toward the stairs. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the feel of his pulse under her fingers and the way he'd looked at her when she started stitching, like she'd done something that rearranged his categorization of her. In the morning, she walked into his office without knocking. He was sitting behind his desk, shirtless, bandage secure, looking like a man who had also not slept. The office was stacked with paper, manila folders, printed spreadsheets, a red notebook with a broken clasp. "Your books are a mess," she said. He looked at her. "My accountant disappeared 4 days ago, took encrypted files and left." "What do you need done?" A long pause. "I have shipments that need to be cleared, payments that need to be routed, and 3 shell corporations that haven't filed their quarterlies. I was an accounts receivable clerk for 5 years before the firm folded. I know how to move money without leaving obvious seams." She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. "Put me to work or let me sit in the library. Those are the same 2 options I have either way." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to read as a kind of grudging respect. Then he slid the red notebook across the desk. "Passwords are in the front section. Don't touch the routing sequences without checking with me first. And if a wire ends up in the wrong account, the cleanup is ugly." It won't. It didn't. The dinner happened 10 days later. Vasic wanted his inner circle to see him functional. There were 5 men. Auden understood within the first course that this was a test she hadn't been told she was taking. She sat to Vasic's right and kept her face neutral and counted things, exits, the seating order, which man looked at her and which man looked at Vasic looking at her. The most dangerous one was the man on the left. Kirsch, lean, angular, with the particular ease of a man who had mistaken intelligence for invulnerability. He waited until the main course. "Heard you've got Gail Merritt's daughter running your books now," he said to Vasic, in the conversational tone people use when they're being deliberately impolite. "What that run you? 50K. The table shifted, not visibly, but Auden felt the attention reorganize. Vasic said nothing. He was waiting for something. She understood in a sudden cold flash that he was waiting for her. She set her fork down. The sound was quiet but precise. 40,000, she said. Not 50. She looked at Kirsch the way she looked at figures that didn't reconcile. Though 40,000 is an interesting number for you to fixate on. You authorized a transfer of 63,000 last month to a holding account in Delaware that had no operational connection to any active contract. The disbursement was categorized as logistics overhead, but there was no corresponding shipment in the system for that quarter. She picked up her wine glass. "I'm still looking for the invoice." The silence at the table had a different texture now. Kirsch's face had gone a shade that wasn't quite color. "She's lying," he said. "She's been here 2 weeks. She doesn't." Vasic moved fast. One moment he was seated, the next his hand was on the front of Kirsch's jacket, and the quiet of the table became a held breath. "Finish that sentence," Vasic said softly. "I'll give you one chance." Kirsch didn't finish the sentence. Vasic released him, smoothed his own jacket, picked up his knife and fork as if the moment hadn't happened. "Auden's findings are my findings," he said to the table. "If she locates a discrepancy, I locate a body. Understood." The chorus of agreement was very quiet and very sincere. For the rest of the meal, no one looked at her. She sat with her spine straight, and her hands steady, and drank the wine, which was very good, and tried not to feel too much about what it meant to be taken seriously for the first time in years. Afterward, she was in the kitchen, glass of water, bare feet on cold tile, running the evening back through her mind the way she ran numbers, looking for errors, looking for things she'd missed. Vasic came in. He'd lost the jacket, the tie. He stood beside her at the counter and looked out at the harbor lights. "The 63,000, he said. "The Delaware account." "Yes. I moved it 3 weeks before you arrived. I wanted to see whether Kirsch was tracking my blind spots." She processed this, set down the glass with care. "You knew I'd find it." "I suspected you might. I didn't know you'd use it at a dinner table, full of men who could have decided you were a liability." He turned to look at her. The kitchen light was low, and his face was doing something she hadn't quite seen before. Not the ledger calculation, not the exhausted authority. Something more direct. "I needed to know whether you were actually capable, or just functional, under controlled conditions. There's a difference. You set me up. I gave you a loaded piece of information and watched what you did with it." She looked at him. The anger was real and immediate. But underneath it, something else was already adjusting, reclassifying. She understood the logic. She'd used it herself, leaving incomplete information visible to Gail, to see what Gail would do with it, which had always been the same thing, which had told Auden everything she needed to know about her options. "Don't do it again without telling me," she said. "That defeats the test. Then find another way to test me." She held his gaze. "I'm not one of your men, Vasic. I'm not going to perform loyalty on command. I'll either be useful or I won't, and that's true whether or not you're watching." He studied her for a long moment. His hand came up and settled against the side of her jaw. Not a grip, just a contact. Rough, careful, the kind of touch that's aware of itself. She grabbed the front of his shirt and kissed him before she could talk herself out of it. It wasn't gentle. It was two people who had been circling something for weeks and had finally stopped pretending there was a reason not to. He made a low sound against her mouth, and his arms came around her, pulling her in against his chest, and she kissed him with everything she'd been holding down for 2 years. The exhaustion, the anger, the slow-burning fury of being perpetually underestimated. When he pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead dropped to her shoulder. "Your stitches," she said. I'm aware of my stitches. They stayed like that for a long time, rain starting again against the glass. The attack came 10 days later. Not a warning, not a build-up, just the sudden catastrophic sound of the front doors going, and then the alarm, and then gunfire in a register that left no room for disbelief. Vasic was in her doorway in under 30 seconds. Rifle, tactical vest, the controlled urgency of a man already 3 steps ahead of the situation. "Kirsch," he said. "He fed our entry protocols to a competing faction. We have a narrow window before they breach the inner doors." She was already on her feet. "The security lockout. Can you override it?" He wiped the network. "I'm locked out of the bunker system." The accounting terminal in the East office. She was already moving past him into the hallway. Kirsch used the same encryption architecture for the security grid that he used for his private accounts. "I found the signature when I was auditing. If I can get to the terminal, I can bypass the biometric lock from the software layer." Vasic caught her arm. "If you're wrong, we're trapped in a room with no exit." The sound of boots on the stairs was getting closer. "I'm not wrong about numbers," she said. He held her gaze for half a second. Then he took her hand, and they ran. The East office was cold, server racks humming, the air thick with the smell of hot equipment. Vasic took position at the door, while Auden dropped into the chair at the main terminal and started moving. The command interface was familiar. She'd spent 2 weeks in this architecture, learning how Kirsch had organized things. She knew his habits. Arrogant men reused their frameworks. They built their private schemes with the same tools they used for everything else, because they couldn't imagine anyone knowing enough to look. "They're at the top of the stairs," Vasic said. His voice was steady but compressed. 90 seconds. She found the security directory. She found the bunker lock protocol. And then, in the same moment, she found something else. An active transfer, Kirsch's failsafe. He wasn't just locking them out. He was draining the operating accounts, payroll, logistics, everything liquid, into a private escrow in the Caymans. The progress bar sat at 31%. If Kirsch took the money, there was no organization. No money meant no soldiers, meant no leverage, meant Vasic was a figurehead ruling over ashes. Even if they survived the night, he'd spend the next month fighting off every crew that had been waiting for a weakness. If the organization fell, she fell with it. She'd be back to nothing, less than nothing. She didn't stop the transfer. Stopping it would trigger the fail-safes. Instead, she opened the destination field and replaced the Cayman routing number with a shell account she'd established on day 3 of managing the books. A structure with her name on the internal authorization and no visible connection to Vasic or anyone near him. She'd told herself it was professional prudence. Maybe it was. Maybe it was something older than that. The habit of a woman who had learned to always know where the door was before the room caught fire. She changed the destination. She pressed enter. Then she went back to the security directory and opened the bunker lock. The mechanical groan of the vault door vibrated through the floor. "It's open," she said, pulling the external drive from the terminal. Vasic grabbed her hand and they moved. The vault door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss that swallowed every sound from outside. Emergency lights came on, low and orange. Auden sat on the cold metal floor and worked on getting her breathing under control. Vasic was against the door, head back, chest heaving. His bandage had bled through again. "Tell me about the accounts," he said, when he had enough breath for it. She set the drive on the floor between them. Kirsch started a drain on the operating funds. I couldn't stop it without triggering his fail-safes, so I let him initiate the transfer and changed the destination. To where? An account I control, 68 million, once it clears. The silence in the bunker had a particular quality. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He looked at her the way she'd looked at his first set of books, like he was reassessing something he'd thought he already understood. "You could have put yourself on that account and disappeared," he said. 68 million and a 4-hour head start. No one would have caught you. "I know. Why didn't you?" Auden looked at her hands, covered in concrete dust and the faint shadow of his dried blood from weeks ago. She'd spent 2 years being defined by what other people decided she was worth. Gail's dead weight, the firm's expendable junior, a $40,000 solution to someone else's bad math. Because running is what people do when they don't have options, she said, and for the first time in a long time, I have options. She met his eyes. The money is yours. It was always yours. I secured it. That's a different thing. Vasic reached across the small space and curved his hand around the back of her neck and pressed his forehead to hers. You're not collateral, he said. No, she agreed, I'm not. 3 months later, Auden stood on the upper level of a warehouse overlooking the harbor, wearing a blazer that fit like it was made for her because it had been, and watched a logistics operation run with the precision she'd spent 8 weeks engineering out of Kirsch's deliberate chaos. Vasic came up the stairs and handed her a coffee. He moved with the slight stiffness that would probably never entirely leave his left side, but his presence was unchanged, enormous, self-contained, radiating the particular gravity of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The offshore accounts cleared, he said. I know. I approved them at 6 this morning. She took the coffee. We're up 22% from last quarter. He looked at her sideways, and his face did the thing it had been doing for 3 months now. Not quite a smile, but the shape that appeared when he'd stopped being surprised by her and was simply paying attention. A black SUV pulled into the warehouse below. 2 figures were brought out, not roughly, but without gentleness either. Auden recognized Gail's dyed blonde hair before she recognized anything else about her. The woman looked diminished. The careful suburban performance was gone, replaced by the raw material underneath it, scared and grasping and running out of angles. Poppy stood beside her, not crying, just staring at the concrete floor. They tried to use your name with a crew in Riverside, the man at the door called up. Claimed family association. Vasic stepped back. He folded his arms and looked at Auden. She handed him the coffee and walked down the stairs. Each step rang against the metal. She reached the floor and stopped 10 feet from them. Gail looked up. The relief on her face was immediate and enormous and completely genuine, which was its own kind of revelation. The woman actually believed Auden would help her. She'd done the arithmetic in her head and reached the conclusion that Auden's loyalty was still available, that it survived being sold in a parking garage for $40,000. Auden, Gail breathed. Oh, thank God. We're in trouble, honey, and I know things weren't good between us, but your family and these people. How much? Auden said. $92,000. It was a bad few months the cards weren't. The cards were never going to work for you, Gail. That was always the math. Auden looked at her stepmother with a feeling she hadn't expected. Not rage, not satisfaction. Just a flat, final clarity, the way a ledger feels when the last line balances. You burned the bridge, and then you tried to stand on the water where it used to be. I don't pay other people's bad debts. We're family. You drove me to a parking garage in the rain, and you handed me to a man you believed was going to destroy me, and then you walked away without looking back. Auden kept her voice very quiet. Whatever family was between us, Gail, you spent it that night. Poppy still hadn't looked up. Auden looked at her for a moment, at the girl who had stood in that garage, staring at her phone, who had chosen not to watch, who had let her mother make a choice that couldn't be unmade, and felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, just the recognition of a different kind of wreckage. She looked at the man at the door. Release them, but make it clear they have no backing from this organization. They carry whatever debt they owe to whoever they owe it to. Gail started screaming. Auden turned her back and walked up the stairs and didn't stop until she was at the top, at the railing, looking out at the harbor where the lights of the container ships moved slowly through the dark water. Vasic came to stand beside her. He didn't offer commentary. He'd understood long before she did that some debts didn't need to be forgiven, just closed. The Hartley shipment clears port tomorrow at 6, she said. I'll need to be at the terminal by 5. He slid his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that had become unremarkable over 3 months, which was itself a remarkable thing. Car will be ready at 4:30, he said. She leaned into him and watched the harbor and felt, in the deep and unreasonable center of her chest, something she hadn't felt in so long that it had almost lost its name. Not safe. Safety was a myth she'd stopped believing in somewhere around the first year with Gale. This was something more durable than that, the specific quiet of knowing exactly what she was worth, in a world that had spent years getting the number catastrophically wrong. The ships moved through the dark. The organization breathed around them, orderly and intact, running on the architecture she'd built from a desk in a house that had started as a cage and become, against all reasonable probability, something that felt like hers. She hadn't survived the monster. She had become the one thing the monster respected. That, she had decided, was considerably better.